Welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. We want to pick up our story in 2 Kings chapter 8. As you may remember, the first part of chapter 8 concludes a series of stories of God's grace. In particular, in that story, it was associated with God's deliverance. Well, the rest of chapter 8 and up to chapter 10 then details God's judgment. God is judging his people for their sins, and so he sends Elisha to complete the task of Elijah to anoint the next king of Syria. God is involved in raising up Syria as the enemy and the judgment, or the instrument of judgment, against God's people of Israel for the sins of Ahab and their sins. Ben-Hadad is ill, and he hears that Elisha is coming, and so he sends him a gift. You may remember Ben-Hadad had heard of Elisha because, Elisha had healed by the word of the Lord his servant Naaman from his leprosy. He sends his servant Hazael, and Hazael approaches Elisha with the gifts and asks the question whether Ben-Hadad would indeed survive. Elisha says that he would, but that Hazael himself would become king, and that he would extract severe punishment upon Israel, and this causes him to weep. Hazael takes this news and returns to the king and tells him, yep, you're going to survive, or at least you would be recovering, but then he turns around and kills him. So we know that Hazael would have lived, but he dies at the hand of his servant. Next, then, we find that the history of the story here then gets a little confusing because we go down to the southern kingdom of Judah. And what's confusing is if you may remember, Jehoshaphat had allied himself with Ahab. So much so that Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, had married Ahab's daughter, Athaliah. Well, Ahab had a son named Joram, and Joram of Ahab succeeds him as king. After Jehoshaphat's death, his son Joram succeeds him as king. So we have a king Joram in Judah and a king Joram in Israel. Well, at this point then, Joram in the south is a king who follows after the ways of Ahab, does evil in God's sight, and engenders God's anger against him, and God determines to judge him. He probably is following the advice of his evil wife, Athaliah, following her father's footsteps, and that of her mother, Jezebel. So what happens is that Joram, in his time, Edom revolts. Now they had tried to do that under Jehoshaphat's rule, but now they succeed. And as Joram goes to take the army to subdue them, he barely escapes with his life. Then we find out in 2 Chronicles chapter 21 that the Philistines and others come against Judah, and they take Joram's family captive and leave only his son left. And so he's greatly humbled. And then God adds judgment upon him that he contracts a severe disease of his colon, and he dies a very painful death. Well then, after his death, his son Ahaziah becomes king. Ahaziah aligns himself with Joram to the north, that is Ahab's son, and they are engaged in a battle against Hazael of Syria, who wreaks a certain amount of defeat upon Israel. Part of that was that Joram of Ahab, he then is wounded severely and has to retire from the battle and is resting in Jezreel. Ahaziah then comes to Jezreel to comfort his cousin, and at this point in time we're told that Jehu is anointed to become the next king of Israel by Elisha's servant. There's a quick story about how that happens, and Jehu becomes enraged against all the evil that's been going on, and has a great desire to serve the Lord, and so he takes up the task, and he goes quickly to Jezreel, and he finishes off Jehoram. He also meets Ahaziah, remember, the king of Judah, and he tells his archers to kill him as well. And so he is killed, and his body is taken back to Jerusalem to be buried. Jehu then goes throughout the land, killing all the sons and the descendants of Ahab, annihilating the whole entire household. He kills Jezebel and puts her to death. And the many brothers of Ahaziah and Joram are both killed in the land. And then he gathers all the priests of Baal, and he has them come together as if he is going to worship Baal like Ahab did, but he uses that in a tricking way. He deceives them, and he has them killed. And so he wipes the land clean of Baal worship. But Jehu does not depart from the sin of Jeroboam. Too many J's in this kingdom names here. But anyway, of Jeroboam. And so God leaves him to be judged in the future. But he promises Jehu that his family will reign in Israel for the next 4 generations. But we see God's determination to execute justice. And this all should remind us that God is just, and that evil men may prosper for a time, but God will execute judgment. God has sent his Son. The other thing here, of course, is that God would not judge the people completely, particularly Judah, for the sake of his covenant with David and the house of David. For from David would come Jesus, the Messiah. All this points us to Jesus to come. God will someday send his Son, the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, to execute justice against sin. It's a warning to us that God will indeed judge. And God has sent Christ first to save us from our sins, that we might have salvation. For there is no name under heaven by which we must be saved than Jesus the Christ. Well, that's good news. Good night.